Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much. It's a privilege and it's an honor to be here, and thank you, Lenny, as well. So I'm going to take a brief pause here from what we've been talking about and talk about interviewing survivors of trauma. A lot of the young people that we're seeing and their families as well are survivors of trauma in their home countries and on the journey here to the United States. And their integration here into our society, into our culture here in New York or from whatever city you may be listening from, is also traumatic for them as well. So we have a multi-layered trauma that's going on for this young person, and we need to be sensitive to that as lawyers, in that they're children and they're also child survivors of trauma. So how are we going to do that? We're going to work with this young person to have her tell us her story, which is so important for us as lawyers in making this case, but without re-traumatizing her. And in order to do that, there's certain things that we can prepare of ahead of time. For a lot of us, we'll be working with an interpreter, which might be something new to you in your practice area. And there is an art and a skill in working with an interpreter that's something that you develop. A lot of the young children that we're seeing are Spanish speaking, and some are speakers of indigenous languages, indigenous Mayan languages. Quiche is one of them. So for that, you may definitely need an interpreter for that, unless you're a native speaker of Quiche. So when you're meeting with an interpreter, it's a good idea to actually talk to the interpreter before you're meeting with your client. And that's to make it clear to the interpreter what their role is. And their role is to interpret everything that the client says, no matter how potentially offensive that might be for you. Remember here that you're the attorney. You're someone who's in a position of power. And when your client and your interpreter are seeing you, your young client, you are in a very different social status than that person might be. And as such, from the cultures that they're coming from, there are different cultural barriers for them freely communicating with you. For instance, in certain cultures, and really every culture, certain derogatory terms that young person might have been called that might go towards a claim of asylum, the interpreter might think that those words are too offensive for you as this attorney to hear and simply might not translate that for you. So having the discussion before that no matter how offensive or how potentially irritating it is, that needs to be interpreted so that you can understand exactly what your client says is helpful. And also understand that while everyone may speak Spanish, or a lot of these kids speak Spanish, there are different words for different nouns in different countries. So the Spanish from the Dominican Republic might be actually very different in certain ways from the Spanish from El Salvador. And so patience and understanding and always asking for clarification is important for everyone, both the attorney and the interpreter. In terms of your actual meeting space, whether it's here in your office or if you're in New York at our Safe Passage offices, it's important to actually look at the physical layout of the room and imagine how the child would see it. Again, for survivors of trauma, specifically survivors of sexual abuse or incest or any type of domestic violence, having clear access to the door is very important for that person. So what I do and what I encourage you to do is let the young person choose where he or she sits in the office space that you have. It's your office, it's your conference room. You'll be comfortable anywhere, and if you're not, you can tough it out for a little bit. But for that child, it might be very important to her comfort in speaking with you if she knows that where she's sitting, she has an escape route. Have tissues, have water, have that nearby, have that out and available so that the client can see that, and also let the young person know ahead of time where the restroom is. That might seem perhaps silly, but in certain cultures, it would be considered completely abnormal and to the effect that that young person will not ask you if you're from a different social status or from a different gender where the restroom is. And you don't want someone sitting there uncomfortable because of that. So make sure to do that. Also, prepare your questions ahead of time. With a young person, they might be a bit confused about who you are, especially if it's a team of lawyers, what people's roles are, and how exactly how you are going to help that young person. Always do introductions, at least for the first couple meetings, to make sure that the young person understands that you're her lawyer. If you imagine when you were 10 or even when you were 14 or 15, it was probably very rare, and there weren't a lot of instances where you actually had a lawyer or a team of lawyers who are working for you. That's an unusual thing for a young person to have. So make sure that you take that simple step to make sure that the young person understands who you are. In terms of the questions, give an outline of what you're hoping to accomplish that day to the young person, just as you would if you were teaching a lesson, but be prepared that there needs to be some wiggle room here. There needs to be some flexibility depending on the young person's comfort. So during the meeting, you're establishing trust by explaining the roles of the interpreter to the client, that the interpreter is the voice for the client so that you can understand the client, and that you have told the interpreter that the interpreter is to please interpret absolutely everything that the client says. You're speaking directly to this young person and you're using the first person. You're not looking at the interpreter, you're looking at the young person. You're avoiding technical terms, jargon, idioms, and slang. You're not saying to the young person, oh, your case has been administratively closed, because nobody understands what that means, right? You're explaining it in terms that you would explain to your own children or the teenagers or young people in your life. So you're saying, instead of administrative closure, that your case is on pause with the immigration court, but we might get back to that case later while we look for another way to fix your immigration status. There's a way to explain things in non-legal terms, and you need to find them, and you need to use them when you're talking with this young person. Avoid compound questions, follow up on ambiguities, and most importantly, believe what the young person is saying. For many of these young people, you are the first person that they have told their stories to. And for you as a lawyer, it is extremely empowering for that young person to have someone believe what she is saying, especially if she's been a victim of sexual abuse, of incest, and back home if nobody actually believed what she was saying. So please take that away with you, that your trust and your confidence and your belief in what she's saying is important, just not only for the legal case, but for her as she's growing up in the future. Okay, and I'm going to turn it back over to Lenny as we start in on asylum.